I'm just gonna say this right off the bat. This is one of my favorite video games I've ever played in my life. Which is why it hurts me to say that it's definitely not for everyone, and it's hardly perfect, both cases for several reasons. But if there was ever an argument to be made for video games as art, this is one of the prime examples. I'm not kidding when I say this game was a hell of an emotional roller coaster for me. I seriously laughed throughout the whole game, I cried more than I'd like to admit, and I had a great time. While the gameplay and combat is a bit too easy and simplified for my liking, and the pacing is just all over the place, I was still deeply engaged from beginning to end. As long as you're willing to be patient and you're open to an emotional and unusual narrative, I would consider this game to be a must-play. Before I go into the story and its themes a little bit, I want to stress that its storytelling is Omori's strongest attribute, and it is insanely well done. Seriously, this is one of the best written stories I've ever read in any video game, or media in general. Some of my favorite video game stories include Odin Sphere, Mother 3, and 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. But Omori is so above and beyond that it's not even close. Being told any kind of spoiler ahead of time would be a massive disservice, and I promise that this entire review will be practically spoiler-free. I'll only touch on the basics and be intentionally vague, but I will have to go over some of the story structure to make my arguments clear. Again though, I'm going to be spoiler-free enough to the point that it should be okay. The story follows a group of 6 childhood friends who live a peaceful life and simply want to spend time together. Until one day, a dark force kidnaps one of the friends, Basil. Thus begins the adventure as Omori and his buddies follow clues to track down and rescue their lost friend. But that's only half the story. It takes place in a dream world, which is mostly an idealized reflection of the real world. All of the elements are there, but twisted and warped by nightmarish fears. There was no dark force kidnapping children in the real world. In fact, Basil is just fine. But there is something sinister at play. Following the clues between the real world and the representation of Omori's memories in the dream world eventually leads to the truth somewhere in the middle. That's the general setup of the game's plot. While the game stars children as its primary characters and it has a very upbeat and joyous attitude, there are several good reasons why it's rated M for mature. And it doesn't have to do with the strong language. Omori is clearly influenced by games like Doki Doki Literature Club and Earthbound, which are all about good friends and happy-go-lucky times, up until it's not. However, unlike those games, Omori doesn't pretend or beat around the bush. You can tell from moment one that there's something very wrong going on with these kids and this whole situation that they found themselves in. And the plot reveals itself slowly and in subtle ways the deeper into the game you go. Despite having such a simple art style, both the in-game graphics and the cutscenes, it's a surprisingly scary and unnerving game. It's more than just a Sonic.exe type creepypasta though, what with the hyper-realistic blood and graphic corruption. Omori is just uncomfortably slow and quiet to sit through at times. And it only gets more intense the further in you go. Seriously, I had a hard time sleeping some nights while I played this game. But let's talk about the graphics. The most notable thing about Omori is that it's an RPG Maker game. Specifically, RPG Maker MV, the engine introduced back in 2015. While RPG Maker games can have a reputation of being low effort by amateur developers, that's not always the case, and some of the most creative and beloved games out there have been made on various iterations of the engine. So if you have a knee-jerk reaction to Omori being an RPG Maker game, and rightfully so, well, I'd still encourage you to give it a shot. While the raw graphical fidelity is certainly nothing special, it's the art direction that's absolutely fantastic. It's a case of managing to do so much with so little, with a basic and sometimes even ugly character sprites having a lot of charm to them. The environments and worlds to explore are so varied, creative, and expressive, again, despite being so simple. And then there's the rare use of realistic or alternative art styles to help push that feeling of unease. It's done so rarely, but when it is pulled off, it makes an impression. The art used for combat is also just as simplistic and beautiful. A lot of it's drawn in crayons and it's very whimsical and just fun to look at. And special abilities are animated in such a way that they literally take over the screen. Whether it's characters interacting with each other, flexing as a strength power-up, or direct attacks like Aubrey's headbutt, the art and animation make a big impact. I also want to point out how creative the layout of the combat scenes are. Omori goes for a combat style in the vein of Dragon Quest, Earthbound, Phantasy Star, Wizardry, and other similar RPGs that feature combat from a first-person perspective, with your party being lined up along the bottom. In fact, Omori was originally designed with this style in mind, going for something very similar to Earthbound. What they ended up doing, however, is instead of lining up the party along the bottom of the screen, they decided to have the character portraits surround the enemy. It seems like it might be a minor creative choice that doesn't make a big difference, but it is a unique aesthetic and it contributes well to the combat's theme of teamwork, which I'll get into more later. The dialogue and writing is something that's harder to explain. You have to play the game for yourself to get a good understanding of what it's all about and why it works so well. I'm also trying to avoid spoilers here, so I can't go into too much detail, but basically, it manages to hit a lot of moods and emotions, and it's almost always a home run. It's actually impressive how much Omori presents in its story, and so little of it is left by the wayside or poorly expanded upon. It's pretty much all stellar. It's both hilarious and depressing, it's cute and charming, but also very dark and dreary. It's an inviting and warm world that encourages you to explore, but you can tell right away how mysterious and cold the game can be. Most of the humor isn't directly comedic or relies too much on wordplay, but it's more so about how the characters interact with each other. Kel and Aubrey are the most direct and obvious examples. The two annoy and hate each other throughout the whole game, and their antics are really fun to see play out. If you ever read something like Azumanga or Yotsuba, then that's the kind of direction I'm trying to express. I just find childhood innocence to be hilarious when it's pulled off well. Aside from that, a lot of scenarios and characters are just completely absurd. For example, you meet a centaur who got second place for being a horse. When you later find a mole with the first place trophy, your only explanation is that his species are highly intelligent creatures. It's a very stupid kind of humor that I love, although I suppose mileage can vary on if you like it. On the other side of the spectrum is how emotionally impactful this game can be. This is helped a lot by the game's humor. You grow a strong connection with all these characters over time because you laugh at them and along with them. It's kind of a breaking the ice sort of effect, and it helps a lot that all the main characters are so relatable and down to earth. They have both their flaws and their positive attributes, and the game goes on for so long that you learn a lot about each individual one, especially if you're willing to go out of your way to look for additional content in the game's world. So when you start to get to the point of the game where their courage, their willpower, and their very strength of character is tested, it starts to hurt. At the very least, it certainly did a number on me, emotionally speaking. The ending sequence was the big one above all else. I've actually never cried so hard at a video game in my life. It made a huge impact on me, and I was not expecting that. All the build-up throughout the entire game, all the way up to the end credits, it actually has a big payoff, and it makes it all worth it. I'm dancing around spoilers here, and I don't like to tell people to just take my word for it, but I refuse to go into it much deeper than this. I think that what impresses me the most about Omori is that I've never played through another piece of media that handles such mature themes in such a respectful and intriguing manner. And it covers some really heavy topics. Coping with loss and trauma, overcoming grief and personal guilt, the fragility of friendships, the comfort and dangers of escapism. It's just that there have been several games like Heavy Rain and Gone Home that try to tell a bigger message, but it feels so artificial and unrealistic. With Omori, I believe in the message being told. It's a powerful and serious one, and it's presented with the utmost respect. I don't want to come off like an expert, but from my experience, this has to be one of the greatest video game stories ever told. I know that's a bold claim, but Omori's just gotta be up there. It certainly is for me, at least. I know this has already dragged on for way too long, but now I'll finally move on to the gameplay. Omori is your traditional turn-based RPG, and just like Earthbound or Super Mario RPG, enemies are encountered via contact on the field rather than at complete random. There's a lot to cover here, so bear with me. Unlike what I would call turn-heavy RPGs, like Final Fantasy X, RFL, or Octopath Traveler, where it's pretty clear whose turn is going to come up next, Omori opts for a traditional JRPG route of commanding your whole party at the start of the turn, and then the allies or enemies with the fastest speed actually act first. This is a system I usually don't like, especially when it can be very unclear and even randomized, like in the older Final Fantasy games, but Omori does a great job at keeping the turn order consistent and allowing the player to strategize around that. Each party member has a set of skills, and their repertoire increases as you progress in the game. Just like in Pokemon, only 4 skills can be equipped at a time, although they can be easily swapped in and out whenever you want. I'm annoyed that I can't have access to everything at any time in battle, but I can see how this limitation helps keep the game balanced. If you could have every buff and debuff ability, along with everyone's strongest and situational attacks, then you'd be pretty damn powerful and the game would be a lot harder to balance. With hero skills in particular, he has several healing abilities for different situations, so deciding on which ones are most important to you helps create a personalized playstyle. On top of the skills, there's the follow-up attacks, which is where the game emphasizes teamwork among the party. Kel can pass his ball to Omori, but Omori might miss the catch and it'll make him sad. Aubrey might look to Kel for approval, but he'll just egg her on and make her angry. This might not sound like positives, but the character's emotions affects the gameplay in interesting ways, and the follow-up attacks mechanic is a simple but really interesting way of adding a little bit of additional depth. It's also really cool that these follow-up attacks will change and upgrade at the end of each chapter, indicating that the group of friends have bonded closer together and are now more effective as a team. Follow-up attacks require energy to use, which is that huge bar on the bottom of the screen, and energy only increases from the party receiving damage. It's an interesting take on Final Fantasy's limit break for a comeback mechanic, considering how diverse your options are. I like it, it's a pretty cool idea. Finally, the last thing to cover is the emotion system, which ties everything together. There are 3 main emotions: happiness, anger, and sadness. Feeling each emotion at a particular time comes with positives and benefits, on top of playing off each other in a rock, paper, scissors sort of fashion. As enemies change their own emotions, or inflict emotional statuses upon the party, you can respond in much the same way in order to turn the tide of battle. While this mechanic isn't stressed upon too much at first, it doesn't take long to realize how important it is to utilize in order to effectively defeat the stronger enemies and bosses. One of the things I like the most about how the game's combat is balanced is that Hero is the only effective healer in the party. And while you can just mash the basic attack and then have Hero heal everyone afterwards, that's a very inefficient way to deal with combat. I had this complaint about Final Fantasy VII, where it didn't make too much of a difference who was in your party or what you did, and healing magic was so cheap that relying on that was actually your best course of action. With Omori, it's actually faster and a lot more effective to use follow-up attacks, skills, manipulating emotions, and involving the whole party to fulfill their roles. It's a fantastic idea and I really love it, but it is lacking in some ways. So, I reviewed The Thing on PS2 recently, and that game had a bunch of creative ideas and mechanics that never actually get utilized, and when they do, it's usually in scripted sequences. That's not necessarily the case with Omori. The mechanics are implemented legitimately, but it's usually too easy to break and isn't taken far enough. For example, my favorite strategy is for Omori to make the enemy sad, and for Kel and Aubrey to get each other angry. I can do this in a single turn, and in the following turn I have everyone pummel the enemy with little to no issues. Using anger against sadness is insanely powerful, cheap on resources, very easy to set up, and the icing on the cake is Aubrey's headbutt. This move is straight up broken. The majority of boss fights in the game came down to powering up Aubrey and having her spam headbutt over and over. There are some situations where you can't rely on specific emotions as much, and in that case you will need to re-strategize, but for the most part, Aubrey's angry headbutts and Omori's sad poems will get you through just fine. The reason why I don't hate this too much is because you still have to manage Aubrey's health since she damages herself with each headbutt, and it's still a ton of fun to apply a series of buffs and debuffs in order to maximize your party's output. It's just that I do wish the game required a somewhat deeper level of strategy, just a little bit more. The energy meter, which is used for the follow-up attacks, also has a very strange exploitation. You see, the meter only increases by 1 point each time an ally takes damage, regardless of the actual amount of damage received. This creates weird situations where attacks that hit multiple party members usually don't deal all that much damage, and it'll skyrocket your party's energy. On top of that, especially for boss fights, I feel like only maybe half of the follow-up attacks are really worth using, which kinda diminishes the idea a little bit, but it still is an awesome concept. I don't want to harp on this stuff too much because the combat is still very fun, follow-up attacks actually make it feel like the team is working together, there's a huge variety of skills to use, and manipulating emotions is such a cool gameplay concept. It's just that it's a little upsetting to me that such a creative and interesting combat system can be so easily exploited. It's also extremely rare for a boss fight to consist of more than one target. I was waiting for a boss that would have me deal with 3 different emotions at once, but it never occurs. It's also worth noting that, similar to Pokemon again, it's always free to fully heal your party at most of the frequent save points, which really brings down the stakes a lot. Like I said earlier, I really like how creative the game allows the player to be in terms of managing resources in combat, but when those resources are so easily replenished, it kinda defeats the purpose a little bit. The game is also not shy about giving you items. I was drowning in them by the end of the game, but you run into Mari's picnic so often that you're basically always at full health anyway. Alright, let's take a step back and talk about the pacing of the story, because this game is wild about it. First of all, as a story-heavy RPG, there's gonna be a ton of reading to get through, naturally. A good RPG will balance that out, more or less, with equal amounts of dungeon crawling and exposition. Omori does okay with that in the dream world. Once you wake up, you better strap yourself in because you're going to be spending the next couple of hours in pure exposition. The few times that combat is involved is extremely simplistic and it doesn't amount to much. I don't know exactly how much of these moments can be considered scripted, but it definitely comes across as though they might as well be. Seriously, unless you're deliberately rushing through these parts of the game and you don't care to talk to anyone, you can easily spend 2 hours or more before you go back to the dream world and engage in actual gameplay again. Perhaps the craziest part of all is near the very end of the game. There's one boss fight in particular that is a hell of an endurance, and at least for gameplay purposes, it can kind of be considered the final boss of the game. However, once you've gotten past that part, there are at least 5 hours straight of no combat. It's just walking around and exposition until you finally get to the end credits. It is remarkably strange how this game is paced. There are quite a few moments throughout the game with basically no gameplay whatsoever, and it's all exposition for about an hour or two straight, if not longer. And this happens multiple times. Like I said earlier, the story is absolutely incredible, and the payoff is worth it in the end. But you're gonna need some serious patience. Personally, I've always been a gameplay first kind of guy, and even I still love how Omori handles all this, which really surprised me. But I'm not gonna pretend that plenty of people won't think that it drags on for way too long, and I can't exactly blame them either. I still highly recommend it, but I'd be remiss if I didn't make this aspect clear. Now, if my complaints with the combat and the pacing weren't enough, this is the one that really takes it too far. The game features multiple endings, and the main ending, the one that most people will likely get their first time around, also puts a hard, definitive end on the gameplay. What I mean by this is, in most RPGs, you're typically allowed and encouraged to save your game before the point of no return. That way you can still go back and do a bunch of optional stuff that you may have missed. In Omori, not only is that not an option, but in order to access a wealth of gameplay-centric endgame content, you have to make specific choices in the story in order to reach it. This means that in order to see everything this game has to offer, you literally need to beat the whole game twice. I don't think I should have to explain why that's a bit of a problem. In a way, this second playthrough can be seen as a sort of New Game Plus. Except it's not, since you're starting over from the beginning and nothing is carrying over from the previous playthrough. If it actually was a legitimate New Game Plus with a higher difficulty and new enemy behaviors, then that would be better and more exciting. But that's not the case. Now, I'm sure this will come off as hypocritical, but honestly, this game is so fun and wonderful that I actually wouldn't mind going through the whole thing another 2 or 3 times. And you'll no doubt catch on to story elements that went over your head on the first playthrough, which is cool in and of itself. But if major gameplay content is hidden behind playing the exact same game twice, especially for a game as long as this, then that's kind of a problem. At this point, I've covered just about everything I want to cover. I'm not going to go over the music too much, other than to say that it's absolutely amazing. It also handles one of my bigger RPG pet peeves where the same battle themes are repeated throughout the whole game. In Omori, each boss and each area has its own battle theme. I really wish more games would do this. But yeah, anyway, the music is super good. This is a really hard game to recommend because you have to be willing to invest and immerse yourself in the story. If you don't allow yourself to take it seriously, then you likely won't get as much of an impact out of it. And I can understand why some people wouldn't. Omori can be very slow, it comes off as being extremely pretentious, and if you don't care for the kind of writing that it presents, particularly the humor, then a lot of the game's charm is gonna be lost on you. The pacing can be all over the place several times. The combat is great, but not quite excellent, and essentially locking the gameplay-centric endgame content behind a second playthrough leaves me with a bad taste. In my heart, personally, I almost want to give this game a perfect score. I mean, just for the story alone, seriously, I'm not kidding, the ending actually made me break down in tears. It was that beautiful. But if I'm going to approach this objectively and offer a general recommendation, then yeah, it's a little bit wacky and you'll need to consider whether or not it seems like it's for you. One thing's for sure, there aren't too many games like it, and fewer still games that can pull it off this well. If any of this so much as sounds like it might be for you, buy it right now. It is worth it. Thanks for watching my review on Omori, and if you want to hear more about it, then I recommend this video by my good friends One Doomed Game Critic and Sticky Rick. Just keep in mind that it has a lot of spoilers. Anyway, thanks again for watching.